It was just after 3 o'clock in the morning on June 6, 2025, as the night air hung heavy above the Angles Air Base. The world, for a brief moment, was perfectly still, oblivious to the storm that was about to break. In the distant east, the sky held only the faintest suggestion of dawn. On the surface, the base was shrouded in routine. Sentries patrolled perimeter fences, watchmen blinked at screens, and radar operators sipped stale coffee to stave off fatigue. Yet far beyond the base's edge, out where the blackness of night concealed ambition and innovation, something extraordinary was in motion. A formation of 17 unmanned aerial vehicles, each one bristling with improvisation and ingenuity. To the untrained eye, they might have seemed harmless, even quaint. Boxy frames, plastic rotors, thermal cameras no bigger than a postage stamp. But these were not hobbyist toys. They were the harbingers of a new age of conflict, guided by cold logic and burning intent. For 6 hours, these Ukrainian-built drones had traveled under the radar, literally and figuratively, crossing 750 kilometers of contested airspace, slipping past enemy observation posts and electronic surveillance nets. They flew low, hugging the landscape, masking their signatures with every kilometer. Unlike the drones of previous wars, there were no direct communications, no guiding hand after the halfway mark. Each was set free by its operators and left to its own onboard intelligence, a feat unthinkable a decade ago. Artificial instincts, how the swarm saw in the dark. The secret wasn't just in their hardware, but in the digital minds within. Each drone was loaded with an AI brain, custom-trained with thousands of overhead images and diagrams scavenged from open-source databases and classified leaks. The neural network had studied every angle, every shadow, every nuance of the Angles Air Base, and most importantly, its fuel farm. A warren of cylindrical tanks, pipelines, and valves that held the literal fuel for Russia's strategic bombers. As they drew near, the leader's thermal optics began to pick apart the depot below, analyzing blurry heat signatures through its grainy sensor. The AI didn't simply recognize a hotspot on a screen. It deduced which tanks had just been filled, which were cooling, which pipes held flammable vapor under pressure. It calculated probabilities, compared layouts, and identified tank number 4 as the highest value target. A single tank, recently topped off, was both the most volatile and the most vulnerable. But here's where the plot thickened. Each drone, working in isolation but using the same neural routines, independently arrived at the same conclusion. No one was giving orders, no drone led the others. It was as if 17 minds, programmed by the same logic, each performed the same intricate dance without needing to speak a word. In military terms, this was distributed autonomy, a nightmare for defenders and a dream come true for innovators. Their flight plans reflected this self-organization. Each drone adjusted its bearing and altitude, careful to avoid both mid-air collisions and overlapping blast zones. One would come in from due west, another from the northwest, others splitting their approach at precisely calculated angles. The effect was a wall of precision, each attack vector chosen for maximum chaos and minimal chance of mechanical mishap. The invisible hand, losing control on purpose. Meanwhile, back in Ukraine, the team who had launched the attack had already relinquished control. For the last half hour, the drones had been out of touch, unreachable, even if the operators had wanted to intervene. The final moments of the mission now played out in total silence, a test not just of technology, but of faith in the very idea of autonomy. The nerves in the Ukrainian control center were palpable. Technicians stared at screens that no longer offered feedback. The last faint cell signals had vanished, leaving only a trail of vanished blips on the monitoring software. Officers debated the odds. Would Russian jammers succeed in blinding the navigation? Would anti-air batteries catch them on their final run? Would the drone's collision avoidance code hold under pressure? There was nothing left to do but wait and watch, their own fate tied to lines of software, cheap electronics, and the unpredictable variables of modern warfare. Stealth by simplicity, how the defenders missed the threat. Unaware of what was coming, the Russian defenders at Angles Air Base had little reason to panic, at least not yet. The base's outer shield was the fabled S-400 air defense system, positioned with mathematical precision and boasting an arsenal worth more than most countries' annual defense budgets. Radar operators watched vast displays, their screens filled with the echoes of migrating birds, distant weather patterns, and the occasional civilian aircraft. What the system wasn't prepared for was an assault by ghosts. 17 small drones flying lower than most trees, each built from materials that reflected almost no radar at all. The S-400's radars scanned the horizon relentlessly, but at 50 meters above the ground, the Earth's curvature and ground clutter masked the incoming threat until it was almost upon them. Their threat database was a marvel of engineering. Fighter jets, cruise missiles, even stealth bombers, all easily categorized, color-coded, and prioritized. But nothing in their logic circuit suggested that a $90 plastic drone might one day become an existential risk. Inside the perimeter, the base commander trusted that, even if something did slip through, the Pantsir S-1 batteries ringed around the depot would finish the job. These self-propelled gun missile hybrids were the pride of modern Russian design, festooned with sensors and bristling with twin 30mm cannons. Promotional videos showed them easily destroying everything from smart bombs to cruise missiles. But real combat rarely mirrors the marketing. The Pantsir's radars were calibrated for larger threats, and their missile guidance systems demanded a minimum radar signature to lock on, a signature these drones lacked by an order of magnitude. The thermal sensors were better, but tracking a moving dot smaller than a football at night among the heat haze of a sprawling depot was almost impossible. Electronic countermeasures, when jammers do nothing. The Russians had not been complacent. They had blanketed the airbase with electronic countermeasures, particularly the Pol 21 GPS jammers, broadcasting fake location data on every frequency the West had ever used. These jammers could send even sophisticated drones tumbling off course or trick them into landing harmlessly in a field. But the Ukrainian engineers had anticipated this, because their drones didn't use GPS at all. Instead, they navigated like the pilots of old, using magnetometers, gyroscopes, accelerometers, and dead reckoning calculations to keep track of direction and distance traveled. The jammers, for all their expense and sophistication, were irrelevant to a system that didn't listen in the first place. Even if the defenders had realized this, there was little they could do. The drone swarm was already inside the electronic curtain, close enough that jamming would only confuse their own radars. Closing in, the final approach. As the clock struck 03:03, the formation began to transform from a scattered group into a battle line. The lead drone's onboard computer, having completed its final checklist, signaled the others by protocol, a silent agreement embedded in their programming. 7 drones ascended to 80 meters, preparing to plunge straight down onto the thin steel rooftops of the fuel tanks. 5 maintained an altitude of 50 meters, ready to strike the upper tank walls where vapor collected. The last 5 dropped even lower, aiming for the weld lines at the tank's bases, where metal fatigue was most likely. Back in the Russian command post, a junior radar operator was the first to notice something strange. A flicker appeared on the screen, altitude 50 meters, closing at 150 kilometers per hour. The computer tagged it as unknown, low priority. He toggled to the thermal camera and blinked in surprise. A tiny, distinct spot of heat, quickly joined by others. 17 contacts spaced almost perfectly along a 3-kilometer arc. His training told him this couldn't be a normal bird, nor a civilian aircraft. Instinct, helped along by adrenaline, pushed him to press the emergency engage button. Missiles screamed into the sky, guided by radars that could barely see their targets, their command links flickering in and out. One after another, the missiles failed to detonate, the fuses unable to lock onto such a tiny, irregular return. The anti-aircraft guns opened fire, tracers stitching the darkness. But at these distances, and with such small, nimble targets, the odds were laughable. Shells burst in the air, scattering shrapnel harmlessly into the night. Meanwhile, each drone's collision avoidance system kept them perfectly spaced, automatically weaving away from each other even as the sky filled with metal and fire. It was a scene that felt more like science fiction than war. Inferno unleashed, the moment of impact. At precisely 03:08, the silent calculus ended. The lead drone, following its final instructions, plunged toward Tank 4. Its 3.2-kilogram warhead, designed as an inverted copper cone, struck the tank's roof with pinpoint accuracy. The shaped charge sliced through 8 millimeters of steel, detonating in the vapor-rich space above thousands of tons of aviation fuel. In a fraction of a second, the tank transformed into a bomb. The explosion created a supersonic shockwave, blasting the roof into the sky, peeling back the walls and sending a tide of flaming fuel across the tarmac. 3 more drones hit their marks in quick succession. Tanks 1, 7, and 12 erupted in sequence, their roofs spinning away, the air filled with the sound of metal and the thunder of fire. The automated fire suppression system responded immediately. Deluge nozzles activated, foam poured over the flames, green lights blinked desperately on the control room panel. But the system was never designed for an onslaught like this. Foam stores were exhausted within 2 minutes, overwhelmed by the scale of destruction. As heat soared past 1800 degrees Celsius, pipelines feeding the tanks ruptured, spewing burning fuel in every direction. Fire crews attempted to approach, but their vehicles blistered before they could reach the inferno. Emergency shutoff valves, designed in another era, failed one by one as their seals melted. Within 10 minutes, the entire fuel depot was engulfed. A boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion ripped apart Tank 6, sending a shockwave that shattered windows kilometers away. For the first time in modern Russian history, a strategic airbase had lost its lifeblood not to bombers or cruise missiles, but to a handful of cheap networked drones. Aftershocks, the new rules of war. As dawn broke over the devastation, the implications began to sink in. The burning fuel was no ordinary aviation kerosene. It was a specialized blend formulated for Russia's nuclear-capable bombers, Tu-160s and Tu-95MS. With those tanks gone, sorties would be impossible for weeks, if not months. Across Russia, base commanders and Air Force generals did the math. If such a strike was possible at angles, then no target, no matter how distant, was truly safe. The Ukrainian operators, who had watched the mission unfold in total radio silence, received the first satellite images within hours. Plumes of black smoke rose over the base, visible for miles. News outlets around the world picked up the story, analysts scrambling to understand what had happened. Videos circulated showing the aftermath: twisted steel, scorched earth, ruined infrastructure. On the internet, the event went viral. Military forums debated every detail. Experts pored over the apparent simplicity of the attack, marveling that parts ordered online and code written by volunteers could undermine one of the world's most sophisticated defense networks. Within the Russian command structure, a reckoning was underway. Urgent memos called for improved detection, more resilient radar systems, hardened backup communications, and new strategies for countering autonomous swarms. Engineers and officers who once dismissed small drones as little more than a nuisance now understood their true threat. Not their strength, but their intelligence and their numbers. Epilogue: the lessons written in fire. For the rest of the world, the attack on Engels Air Base was a wake-up call. A message written in burning fuel and twisted steel. Wars were no longer only about massive budgets, advanced jets, or the latest missile system. They were about adaptability, creativity, and the clever repurposing of civilian technology. In this new era, dominance would belong not to the largest army, but to the side willing to experiment, innovate, and put trust in machines, and in the humans who taught them to think. In Ukrainian cities, news of the mission spread quickly. The engineers who had built the code and assembled the drones celebrated quietly, well aware that tonight's success would soon be met by new countermeasures, new defenses, and new challenges. War, after all, was a race with no finish line. Meanwhile, in Russia's military heartland, another calculation began. One that weighed not just the cost of replacing destroyed bombers and burned fuel, but the risk of leaving Moscow itself within reach of the next swarm. 17 drones had flown into history that night. 16 had found their targets. Their message was simple. In a world ruled by code, plastic, and silicon, the rules had changed forever.